Hello, weary traveller. Come, sit by my fire. The night is long, and the stars above hold many secrets. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the fall of Rome and the rise of feudal Europe, a time when the great empire's collapse left peasants, servants and lords to weave a new order from the fragments of a broken world. Close your eyes, if you will, and drift back with me to a time of honour, peril, and the song of steel at dawn. Tell me, wanderer, where do you listen from, and what hour finds you now? If my tale stirs something in you, then leave a like, and subscribe only if your heart says these stories are worth returning to. When the legions of Rome withdrew from the western provinces in the 5th century, the world I walked into was marked by silence, where once there had been roads alive with traders and governors. Cities crumbled, aqueducts fell into disrepair, and the order that had bound Europe together dissolved like sand through an open hand. In its place rose a void that no single power could fill, leaving scattered kingdoms and fearful villages vulnerable to raids and famine. I remember the whispers of men who had once called themselves citizens, now left to barter with chieftains and local warriors for safety. Without the empire's laws, it was the sword and the fortified hill that dictated survival. The idea of belonging to a vast empire faded, replaced by a desperate reliance on whomever could build walls of stone and promise protection. The shadow of Rome lingered only in broken statues and forgotten Latin prayers. Castles began to rise where Roman villas had once stood, not as symbols of culture, but as bulwarks against chaos. Their walls were crude at first, timber palisades hastily erected, but soon the stone fortresses appeared, grim against the sky. Within those walls, peasants and servants bent their backs in exchange for the Lord's shield, entering into bonds that would define centuries. The empire's collapse did not bring freedom, but another form of binding. In this new order, the memory of Roman citizenship mattered little. What counted was whether one had land to till or arms to wield. Those without either became dependents, their service the price of survival. I saw proud families reduced to servitude, bound not by chains, but by hunger, compelled to seek shelter within the reach of a castle's drawbridge. The dream of Rome was gone, but the burden of duty remained. The vacuum of power was not just political, but spiritual. The church stepped into the emptiness, its bishops claiming authority over souls and fields alike. Where emperors had once decreed, now priests and lords together shaped the lives of the common folk. And so, while Rome's ruins lay quiet, a new and harsher order wrapped itself around the people, guiding them into the grip of feudal bonds. I often think of the roads, once smooth and straight, now broken paths where bandits waited. Trade dwindled, and isolation became the rhythm of life. To live was to look no further than the land around one's village, for the wide horizons of Rome had narrowed into the confines of a lord's estate. The collapse did not end oppression. It changed its form, bringing it closer, more intimate, harder to escape. Those who carried steel profited from the disorder. Local warlords carved out dominions, each demanding labour and loyalty in exchange for uncertain security. Their banners were less majestic than Rome's eagles, but for the poor farmer, they were the difference between life and death. Violence and oaths replaced law, and this fragile pact became the marrow of feudal Europe. As I sit now by this fire, I still feel the weight of that transformation. Rome had promised a vast world, but its fall left men clutching to fragments of safety. From those fragments, the castle rose, and with it came a system where the many bent under the yoke of the few. It was not liberty that followed the empire's end, but a servitude dressed in stone walls and sworn oaths. In the centuries after Rome's fall, life was stitched together by oaths rather than written law. Lords granted land, those precious fiefs, to warriors who swore loyalty in return. Beneath them, peasants and servants pledged their toil, not through choice but necessity, binding themselves to the soil as if it were their very skin. These agreements were not sealed with parchment for the humble, but with the weight of hunger and fear of invasion. I recall how the lords spoke of protection, of safety within the shadow of their walls. Yet protection was never freely given. It demanded obedience, labor, and the surrender of freedom in exchange for survival. The feudal bond was less a promise of care than a bargain of power, one side giving, the other enduring. The language of duty wrapped itself in piety, but at its heart lay compulsion. Those who held land wielded authority far beyond the fields. They collected dues, enforced justice, and claimed the right to a man's service in times of war. The vassals who enjoyed favor could rise, but for the servants in the kitchens and fields, the contract meant endless work. Theirs was not an oath chosen, but a life inherited, passed from parent to child like an unshakable chain. The rigidity of this order crushed hope of escape. To be born into service was to remain in it, no matter the strength of one's arm or the quickness of one's mind. Lords and bishops proclaimed it was the natural order, ordained by God, and so it endured for centuries. The words loyalty and obedience became not virtues, but fetters upon the weak. I often saw men bend their knees before their masters, swearing oaths with hands upon relics. Their faces carried no joy, only resignation. They knew that without the Lord's favor, they would be left to the wolves of famine and the fire of raiders. The bond may have been spoken as mutual, but its weight fell heaviest upon the shoulders of the powerless. Even those who served closest to their lords remained little more than possessions. A cook could labor for decades without tasting freedom, and a maid might serve generations of the same family, her own bloodline swallowed into servitude. The feudal contract ensured continuity, but it also ensured despair. Its design was not to lift men upward, but to hold them firmly in place. And still, the castle thrived because of these bonds. Every stone laid, every field harvested, every banner raised in war rested upon the shoulders of those bound by the contract. The lords may have boasted of loyalty and order, but what they truly possessed was control. In their halls of stone, they ruled not by justice, but by dependency. When I think back, I see the faces of those who served in silence. Their loyalty was never rewarded with freedom, their obedience never repaid with rest. The contract that shaped feudal Europe was no pact of equals, but a binding that chained generations. Its endurance was a testimony not to fairness, but to the endurance of those who bore it. The walls of a castle told their own story, one of separation and control. Towers rose high for the lords, while below, cramped chambers held those who served. Kitchens were hidden in smoky depths, stables filled with the stench of laboring beasts, and storerooms piled with grain guarded like treasure. This division of space was no accident, for stone itself became a reminder of rank. I walked those halls often, and each step revealed the gulf between privilege and servitude. The great hall glittered with tapestries and feasts, yet behind the doors lay kitchens where sweat and smoke consumed the servants. Nobles dined on venison and wine, while the hands that prepared it gnawed on stale bread. Walls that should have sheltered all instead divided them. Servants slept where heat and air were scarce, beneath stairwells, above barns, or in huts along the castle's edge. Their quarters were dark, their bedding little more than straw. Meanwhile, lords reclined in chambers warmed by fires and perfumed by herbs. This stark contrast reminded every servant of their place in the order, their labor enriching lives they could never share. Every corner of the castle carried a purpose that reinforced obedience. Guard towers loomed, not only to watch for enemies, but also to remind servants that escape was near impossible. Gates were closed, not only against raiders, but against the poor within. Architecture served not just defense, but discipline, shaping the lives of all who dwelled inside. Daily life unfolded in rhythms dictated by space. The clang of iron from the smithy, the shuffling of feet in kitchens, the bleating of sheep in inner courtyards. These sounds blended into the hum of ceaseless labor. Nobles heard them as background, but to servants they were chains, echoing through their every waking hour. At feasts, I watched servants line the walls like shadows, their presence silent but necessary. They carried platters too heavy for their thin arms, poured wines they would never taste, and disappeared again into the depths of the castle. The grandeur of noble gatherings was built upon their hidden suffering. The very stones of a castle enforced order more effectively than words. Staircases that spiraled kept attackers at bay, yet they also funneled servants into strict routes of movement, ensuring they remained unseen. The division of chambers created a world where visibility was privilege, and invisibility the lot of the servant. As the fire beside me crackles, I remember how oppressive those walls could feel. The castle was not merely a fortress, it was a prison for those who toiled within. Its architecture preserved the lord's authority as much as it kept enemies out, and so stone and mortar became the silent jailers of countless souls. There came a time when the burden of labor was no longer just an unspoken expectation, but a law carved into the lives of peasants. By the 9th century, men and women who had once been free to wander found themselves tethered to land they did not own. They were called serfs, their names bound to the soil as tightly as the crops they tended. Their bodies were not sold like slaves in distant markets, but their freedom was equally denied. I remember how a serf could not leave without permission, even if hunger gnawed at his children. A lord's word was final, and to walk away from the land was to risk punishment, sometimes even death. The fields that stretched beneath castle walls were both livelihood and prison. Even marriages and inheritances required approval, reminding all that their lives belonged more to the Lord than to themselves. The obligations were relentless. Not only did serfs labor their own small plots, but they were summoned to the Lord's fields, expected to plough, sow, and harvest without rest. Their work fed the garrisons, filled the storerooms, and sustained the wealth of those above them. The rhythm of their lives was not their own. It beat to the drum of obligation. The distinctions between serfdom and slavery were thin, almost invisible. Though a serf could not be sold away from the land, he was bound so deeply that leaving was unthinkable. Lords took dues in grain, livestock, and labor, extracting the marrow of every season. Generations inherited this fate, born into servitude as though it were their natural inheritance, passed down like a shadow over bloodlines. I saw how their backs bent under the strain, not just of tools and burdens, but of the knowledge that escape was impossible. Even in times of famine, the quotas remained, forcing men to surrender the little they had. Lords cloaked their demands in words of order and tradition, but beneath the robes of authority lay exploitation plain and harsh. Those within the castle depended utterly on this labor. Without the serfs, there would be no bread on noble tables, no hay for horses, no mortar for walls. Yet the very hands that sustained the fortress were given no voice in its affairs. Silence was demanded, and silence was endured, though bitterness smouldered beneath. Religion was often used to soothe their plight. Priests reminded serfs that their earthly suffering was but a passage to heavenly reward, urging obedience as though it were divine will. I watched men bow their heads, not out of faith alone, but from the resignation that resistance meant ruin. The bond was thus reinforced not only by law, but by belief. Now, as I sit in reflection, I see serfdom for what it was, a cage without bars, a slavery without the market. The land they tilled was not theirs, yet it consumed their bodies and souls. Their lives became threads woven into the fabric of feudal power, their names forgotten, their labor remembered only in the stones of the castles they sustained. From the moment the first light crept through arrow slits, the work of servants began without hesitation. Water had to be hauled from wells, fires stoked in the kitchens, and the stables tended before the lords even stirred from their beds. Tasks overlapped, each demanding swiftness and silence, for hesitation could mean a reprimand. The rhythm of their days was endless toil, measured not by hours, but by duties completed. I recall seeing hands raw from scrubbing stone floors with sand, nails broken from endless labor at the grindstone. Servants carried buckets of refuse to the dung heaps, their bodies bending under loads that never seemed to lessen. Some cleaned latrines, an unspoken duty no lord acknowledged, but every servant dreaded. They were the invisible lifeblood of the castle, though their suffering was scarcely seen. The kitchen was a place of ceaseless fire and sweat. Great cauldrons hung over flames, tended by men and women whose clothes were soaked with smoke. They prepared roasts and stews for feasts they themselves would never taste, surviving instead on coarse bread, pottage, and what scraps were left behind. The nobility feasted in grandeur, while the servants' bellies remained hollow. Servants also bore the weight of the castle's defense. They sharpened weapons, hauled stones for repairs, and carried water to soldiers on the walls. Though they did not wear armor, their labor kept the fortress strong. When sieges loomed, they worked twice as hard, yet their reward was not honor, but greater hunger as supplies dwindled. I often noticed how their beds offered no rest. Straw pallets, damp and crawling with vermin, awaited them after days of relentless toil. Sleep was shallow, for the cock's crow meant another dawn of duties. Their fatigue was constant, but it was never an excuse. Even the sick or injured were expected to continue unless death itself intervened. Their clothing spoke of their place: rough wool, patched and worn, dyed in dull shades if dyed at all. Unlike the silks and furs of their lords, their garments marked them as laborers, their identities reduced to function. Even in appearance, they were reminded daily of the gulf that separated them from those they served. Yet, amid hardship, there were moments of endurance that humbled me. Servants whispered to one another in kitchens, shared crusts of bread in stables, and lent hands when one faltered. These small acts of humanity carried them through the weight of endless work. Their resilience was quiet, uncelebrated, but it endured where grandeur faded. As night returned, servants collapsed in corners, the castle silent save for its watchmen. The grandeur of towers and halls depended upon these weary souls, yet their lives were lived in shadows. Their days were a testament to unseen sacrifice, etched not in chronicles or songs, but in the silent strength that held the stones of the castle together. In the dim corridors and smoky chambers of the castle, it was often women who bore the heaviest burdens. Maids rose before the sun, tasked with scrubbing floors until their knees ached, laundering the garments of nobles, and keeping chambers in order. Their hands were chapped from cold water and lye, yet their work was expected to be invisible, acknowledged only when it faltered. Without them, the rhythm of noble life would stumble. I recall the sight of women carrying great bundles of laundry to streams, breaking ice in winter to wash silks and linens they could never afford themselves. The weight of such labor was doubled by the silence in which it was performed. A lord might wear fine clothes at a feast, but he never saw the frostbitten hands that made them clean. Their labor was swallowed into the fabric of courtly pride. Wet nurses were another presence within the halls, their role both intimate and sacrificial. They nourished the children of lords, offering the milk meant for their own offspring. Many left their babies in cottages or village huts, forced to surrender that bond so that noble heirs might thrive. Their sacrifice was unseen, a quiet theft of motherhood carried out under the guise of duty. For some women, the service carried darker shadows. Chronicles whisper of masters who abused their power, taking advantage of the bodies of those who had no defense. Such acts were seldom punished, hidden behind stone walls where the word of a noble outweighed that of any servant. This lack of protection deepened their chains, stripping not only their freedom, but their dignity. Daily labor often blended with personal sacrifice. Women prepared meals they would not eat, dressed noble children while their own grew in poverty, and obeyed the whims of mistresses whose tempers could turn cruel. Their service was not only physical, but emotional, demanded in smiles, in deference, in silence. Their exhaustion went beyond muscle, resting deep in spirit. Even in sickness, their duties did not cease. A maid with fever was expected to rise. A wet nurse with an empty stomach still had to feed the air. There were no allowances for weakness in their world. To falter was to risk punishment or dismissal into hunger, and so they pressed on, their suffering swallowed beneath obedience. Yet I saw resilience glimmer in quiet ways. Women gathered in kitchens, whispered songs as they worked, sharing stories that softened the weight of their days. Some found strength in their faith, clutching rosaries as they endured their lot. In their endurance, there was a defiance unspoken. Though their lords owned their labor, they could not fully extinguish their spirit. What remains with me is the silence of their sacrifice. Castles shone with grandeur, children of nobles thrived, and garments gleamed at court, all built upon the hidden work of women in service. Their names were not recorded in chronicles, but their lives sustained the very order of the realm, their endurance etched into the stones more deeply than any noble crest. Among the faces that filled the castle's laboring ranks, many were still tender with youth. Children of poor families were often sent into service as pages, kitchen boys or scullions, their small hands put to work before they had learned much of the world. Their tasks were endless, hauling firewood, carrying water, scrubbing floors, and their reward was little more than a crust of bread and a pallet of straw. Childhood, as many know it today, was a gift they never received. I recall the eyes of boys bent over pots too large for their frames, steam reddening their faces as they stirred cauldrons. They polished armor until their fingers cracked, fetched arrows for the fletchers, and brushed horses they would never ride. Some girls, scarcely taller than the brooms they wielded, spent their days cleaning hearths or helping maids with laundry. Innocence faded quickly within those stone walls. Obedience was the lesson taught most fiercely. The lash of a steward's tongue, or at times his hand, ensured that children learned to bow their heads and follow orders. To hesitate was to invite scorn. To resist was to risk harsher punishment. Through such discipline, they were molded into servants who did not question, only endured. For a select few boys, there existed a narrow path upward. Pages who served with diligence might one day become squires, tending to a knight's horse and armor, learning the art of war. Yet even this promise was fraught, for most never advanced beyond menial labor. The dream of knighthood glittered before them, but like a distant star, it was out of reach for nearly all. The daughters of peasants, placed into service, often had no such prospects. They labored beside maids, carrying baskets, grinding grain, or caring for infants not their own. Their futures held no shining armor, only the continuation of service, their bodies and time given over to the needs of the household. The weight of duty fell upon them as heavily as on their mothers. What strikes me most, even now, is the quiet endurance of these children. I saw them collapse in corners of kitchens, asleep before their tasks were done, only to be shaken awake and sent again to work. Their laughter was rare, but when it came, in whispered jokes or stolen moments, it was like a candle in the dark, fleeting, fragile, but precious. The castle benefited immensely from their presence. Their small size allowed them to dart through corridors. Their energy fueled endless chores. Their obedience kept the order steady. Yet they were seldom seen as more than tools, their youth consumed to strengthen the household of others. Their lives were measured in tasks completed rather than joys lived. When I think of them now, I wonder how many ever knew freedom. Few left the castle walls. Fewer still rose beyond servitude. Their names were not carved into stone nor written in records, but their labor held castles together. They were the forgotten pillars of a feudal world, children turned into servants long before they could dream of anything else. It was often spoken that a lord's first duty was to shield his people, yet the truth behind those words was far less noble. Castles rose as bastions of power, their walls promising safety to those who toiled beneath them. But when danger drew near, The protection offered was conditional, reserved for those whose service best suited the master's needs. For the common servant, loyalty was demanded, while safety was never guaranteed. I have seen peasants driven into courtyards when raiders approached, not to be defended, but to labor in fortifying walls and stockpiling supplies. Their hands bled from carrying stones and timber, even as their families huddled in fear. The promise of shelter often proved hollow, for once the storerooms were filled, the lords closed their gates, leaving many outside to face ruin alone. The myth of protection served more as a chain than a gift. In sieges, it was the servants who bore the greatest suffering. Nobles rationed food for their kin and soldiers, while the lowest ranks endured hunger until their bodies wasted. I recall hearing the cries of those too weak to stand, their work demanded still as if famine were no excuse. When the walls finally fell, it was often the servants who perished first, caught between enemy blades and their lord's indifference. The weapons of war did not rest solely in knights' hands. Servants were forced to haul stones for catapults, carry boiling water to battlements, and even take up crude arms when defenders grew thin. They were expected to fight without training, to die without honor, their bodies spent as though they were tools of war rather than human lives. Such was the price of their supposed protection. I once heard lords boast that their people loved them for the shield they provided. Yet that love was more akin to fear, a desperate clinging to the only power that stood between them and destruction. To disobey was to risk exile, and exile meant death. What choice did a servant have but to submit to the illusion of care? Even in peace, this bond of dependence lingered. Lords demanded taxes and dues under the guise of maintaining defences, extracting from the poor in the name of their safety. The castle's towers stood tall, not only against invading armies, but as reminders of the authority that weighed upon every servant's back. Their supposed guardianship was another form of control. The church too played its role, praising lords as protectors ordained by God. Priests preached that obedience would ensure salvation, that the master's shield was a reflection of divine order. In this way, the myth grew stronger, woven into belief as well as law. To question it was to question both earthly and heavenly authority, a perilous act. When I reflect now, I see clearly that protection was a story told to justify servitude. The truth was far grimmer. Servants bore the weight of defense, the hunger of sieges, and the terror of battle without reward. Their dependence was used against them. Their lives spent cheaply, while the lords stood behind walls of stone and words of power. From the pulpits and cloisters, a message was carried into every corner of medieval life. To serve was to obey God's will. The church, powerful beyond kings and castles, sanctified the bonds between lord and servant. Priests told the weary that their place was divinely appointed, that labor and obedience were paths to salvation. Such words offered comfort to some, yet to many, they were chains hidden beneath holy robes. I remember hearing sermons where peasants bowed their heads, told that humility was their greatest virtue. They were urged to endure hunger and fatigue as Christ had endured suffering, with promises of heavenly reward if only they accepted their station. It was not rebellion but patience that was praised, not questioning but submission. The pulpit became as strong a wall of control as the stones of any fortress. The sacred texts were often interpreted in ways that upheld the Lord's authority. The words of St. Paul about obedience to masters were repeated endlessly, used to silence unrest. Meanwhile, the wealth of the church grew, nourished by tithes gathered even from the poorest. The very hands that fed priests could scarcely feed their own children, yet they were told their sacrifice pleased heaven. Pilgrimages and festivals brought moments of hope, but they too reinforced the structure of service. Lords and clergy stood at the center of processions, while servants lined the roads, carrying torches, preparing meals, and singing hymns. Their devotion was demanded as much as their labor, and both became indistinguishable in the cycle of duty. Faith was not only personal, it was a command. There were times when doubt surfaced, when whispers of injustice stirred among the oppressed. Yet rebellion against one's Lord was painted as rebellion against God, a sin too grave for many to dare. Fear of eternal damnation weighed as heavily as the lash of an overseer. The Church's teachings pressed upon the heart, shaping obedience as though it were sacred truth. And yet, I witnessed moments where belief gave strength rather than submission. Some servants clutched their faith not as a chain, but as a candle in the dark, finding solace in prayer after days of toil. Though priests and lords twisted holy words for power, the quiet devotion of the poor often rose above that corruption, giving them resilience that no master could extinguish. Monasteries, too, played their part, receiving gifts of land and labour from lords who sought divine favour. The peasants and servants who worked these lands did so under the same burdens, their labour sanctified not for their own souls, but for the wealth of holy institutions. The Church's grip was firm, binding both castle and countryside in the same net of obedience. Looking back, I see how faith was wielded as both balm and weapon. It soothed the weary by promising eternity, even as it upheld the order that kept them weary. Servants lived and died, believing their suffering was holy, their obedience necessary. In truth, it was not heaven that bound them, but the voices of men who cloaked power in the name of God. Beyond their walls of stone and towers of defense, castles thrived as engines of wealth. They were not only fortresses of war, but also hubs where grain was stored, wool was spun, and taxes were collected. The life of the countryside flowed toward the castle like rivers into the sea. Every field ploughed, every sheep shorn, every barrel of ale brewed found its way upward, enriching the lords who claimed dominion over land and people alike. I remember the sight of carts creaking through castle gates, laden with sacks of grain or bundles of flax. Servants led oxen heavy with timber, or carried baskets filled with poultry and eggs. None of these goods were theirs to keep. They were dues extracted by obligation, the very marrow of feudal economy. The wealth displayed in banquets and armour was built upon the sweat of countless backs. The system of manorial dues pressed relentlessly upon the poor. Grain rents, labour obligations, and corvée, days of unpaid work demanded by the lord, drained what little autonomy servants might have hoped to keep. Even marriage or inheritance was taxed, each step of life marked by a payment. The castle was thus not only a place of refuge, but also the very seat of exploitation. Inside its walls, workshops buzzed with activity. Blacksmiths forged tools and weapons, carpenters repaired carts, brewers prepared ale for the household. Yet these trades were sustained by the produce and effort of peasants whose own needs went unmet. What the nobles called prosperity was in truth the redirection of labour, wealth pulled upward, while poverty deepened below. Markets sometimes sprang near castles, where merchants gathered under the shadow of towers. But even there, the lord's hand was felt, for stalls were taxed and profits skimmed. The illusion of free trade existed only within boundaries set by power. A castle's economy was not the flourishing of many, but the hoarding of few. In times of plenty, the storerooms swelled with grain and salted meat, while peasants outside often still went hungry. The lord's granary was a fortress within a fortress, guarded as fiercely as any wall. And when famine struck, what little was distributed came at a price. More dues, more service, deeper chains. Hunger was wielded as another tool of control. I once watched servants breaking their bodies in the harvest fields, only to see wagons of wheat vanish through castle gates. They tasted little of what they produced, for their labour was not to nourish their families, but to sustain the hierarchy above them. Their toil was a kind of invisible tribute, unending and unacknowledged. When I think of castles now, I do not see only battlements and banners. I see granaries, treasuries, and tallies of debt, the true weapons of lordship. It was not only steel that kept power in place, but the steady extraction of labor and goods. The castle was a fortress of wealth as much as of war, and servants bore the cost of both. Though many spoke of slavery as a relic fading with Rome, its shadow lingered across the medieval world. Captives taken in war, whether in raids between Christian kingdoms or in conflicts with Muslim powers, were often forced into bondage. Some were absorbed into castle households, their identities erased as they became cooks, grooms, or field hands. The distinction between their fate and that of serfs was narrow, blurred by the same absence of freedom. I recall hearing tales of markets in the Mediterranean where men, women, and children were sold to the highest bidder. Vikings raided the coasts of England and Ireland, carrying away captives to be traded in distant ports. Slavic peoples too were seized and dispersed so widely that the very word slave grew from their name. The castle was not separate from this practice. It drew upon the same tide of human suffering. Within walls I once walked, some servants whispered of their origins, torn from villages far away, their tongues foreign, their families lost forever. Unlike serfs, who were bound to land, these souls were bound directly to their masters, with no claim even to a patch of earth. They lived in a silence deeper than others, for their very presence was often hidden from record. The nobles distinguished little between the labor of the enslaved and that of the serf. Both fetched water, tilled soil, tended animals, and endured commands without question. What separated them was not the nature of the work, but the degree of ownership. And yet, for those living it, the weight felt the same. A life without choice, bound to another's will. In southern Europe, the exchange of captives was common, Christian and Muslim alike, trading prisoners across the sea. Faith did not shield one from bondage. It merely shifted who held the chains. I remember hearing monks speak of ransoming Christian slaves, yet such mercy was reserved for those whose families could pay. The poor remained forgotten. Some castles employed these captives as status symbols, paraded before guests to display wealth and power. To see a man or woman treated as ornament, their humanity ignored, was a wound to the soul. And yet those of lower rank scarcely dared to speak, for even serfs feared sharing the same fate. The shadow of slavery darkened all beneath its reach. Over time, the line between slavery and servitude blurred so much that even historians struggled to separate them. To live as a serf was to be nearly enslaved, tied by law instead of by purchase. To live as a slave was to be denied even that meager tie to land, held instead as property outright. Both lives shared the same burden, service without freedom. Looking back, I see that the decline of formal slavery in Europe did not bring liberation to the poor. It merely changed the shape of their bondage, replacing chains of iron with chains of law and custom. Castles stood as monuments to this truth. Whether serf or slave, the laboring soul remained bound, their names lost to history, but their suffering woven into its very fabric. The kitchen of a castle was a place of fire and ceaseless motion, where smoke blackened the beams and sweat clung to every servant's brow. Great cauldrons simmered over open flames, and spits heavy with meat had to be turned without pause. The air was thick with heat and ash, and burns were as common as blisters. Those who labored there endured not only exhaustion, but the knowledge that the food they prepared would never grace their own plates. I often saw men and women bent under the weight of cauldrons filled with broth, their bodies trembling as they carried them across uneven floors. The knives they wielded for chopping were sharp, yet the danger came from haste, for there was never enough time to meet the demands of feasts. The kitchens of nobility did not rest, for the appetite of lords and their guests was insatiable. The sense of roasted venison and spiced wine drifted upward to the halls where nobles gathered, but the cooks themselves lived on coarse bread, onions, and thin pottage. Their labor brought splendor to others, while they themselves remained invisible. The contrast between the delicacies served above and the scraps consumed below was a bitter reminder of their station. When banquets began, the burden of silence fell upon the servants of the great hall. They moved like shadows, pouring wine, carrying platters, and clearing trenches without daring to speak. Their eyes never rose to meet those of the nobles, for to do so was seen as insolence. Even as music played and laughter filled the chamber, servants remained as part of the furniture, present yet unacknowledged. Accidents were feared, for a spilled goblet or a dish dropped upon the rushes could bring humiliation or worse. Punishments for such mistakes were harsh, and the shame lingered long after the mess was cleaned. I saw the trembling of hands carrying pewter plates, the careful steps of boys balancing pitchers, each one praying that fate would not trip them. Hierarchy existed even among those who served. Cupbearers held a higher place than scullions, while carvers stood closest to the lords, slicing meat with ceremony. Yet even these favoured roles brought little comfort, for privilege among servants still meant servitude. Advancement rarely lifted anyone beyond the reach of duty and the weight of obedience. The feasts themselves were spectacles of power, displays of abundance meant to awe allies and rivals alike. Nobles revelled in their wealth, but it was the unseen labour of the kitchen that gave such displays life. Without the weary hands below, the grandeur of the hall would collapse into emptiness. Still, no minstrel sang of the cooks, no chronicle named the scullions. In memory, the great halls gleam with light and sound, yet I recall instead the smoke-filled kitchens and the silent lines of servants. The glory of the feast was built upon their backs, their sweat and silence the true cost of noble magnificence. They stood unseen in the glow of torchlight, the forgotten architects of celebration. Amid the bustle of a castle's labour, there were always figures who carried authority without crowns or armour. These were the stewards, bailiffs and reeves, men entrusted with enforcing the Lord's will among the servants. They walked the courtyards with keen eyes, their presence a reminder that every action was measured. Their role was to maintain order, and order often meant fear. I recall the steward's hand upon a tally book, marking down the grain brought in, the labour owed, the dues collected. His words carried weight heavier than most soldiers' swords, for a mistake in his record could mean punishment for a household. To the servants, he was the visible arm of the Lord, his gaze piercing through excuses, his voice brooking no dissent. The bailiff strode through fields as if they were his own, ensuring every furrow was ploughed and every harvest met its quota. He knew the strength of each family, the hours each man could give, and pressed them to the limit. Under his watch, fatigue was no defence. Only results mattered. His presence turned the soil itself into a ledger of obligation. Within the walls, reeves often rose from among the peasants themselves, chosen to represent the community but bound to enforce duties. This placed them in a cruel position, caught between neighbours and masters. I witnessed the bitterness such roles bred, for a reeve who failed the Lord risked punishment, while one who served too zealously earned the hatred of his kin. Punishments flowed swiftly from these overseers, whether fines, extra labour, or harsher measures. I saw men whipped for tardiness, women scolded publicly for neglecting tasks, children burdened with chores beyond their years. The castle's discipline was not only imposed from above, but maintained daily by these intermediaries, whose authority filled every corner of life. Some sought favour through cruelty, wielding power with relish, knowing that obedience brought them small privileges. Others carried their role with weary resignation, aware they were despised but unable to refuse. Either way, the effect was the same. Servants were watched, controlled, and kept in place. Surveillance did not end with walls, it lived in human eyes. The stewards themselves answered directly to the Lord, and in their loyalty they ensured the smooth running of the estate. To nobles, they were indispensable, the reason the castle's wealth flowed upward without interruption. But to those who bent under their orders, they were the embodiment of oppression, the constant reminder that no task was ever truly done. In reflecting on their presence, I see how essential they were to the system. Not warriors, not priests, Yet their power over common lives was immense. Castles might have crumbled without the labor of servants, but that labor would have faltered without the overseers who drove it forward. They were the gears in the machinery of feudal control, unseen by history, yet feared by all who lived beneath their command. Within the stone walls, discipline was not gentle guidance, but a rod of iron. Servants lived under constant threat of correction, their every action subject to scrutiny. A misplaced tool, a late arrival, or a clumsy mistake could bring consequences far heavier than the fault itself. Punishment was the language through which lords and their officers reminded the lowly of their place. I recall the sound of the whip in a courtyard, its crack silencing all other noise. A boy who had spilled ale at a feast bore lashes upon his back, his cries swallowed by the indifference of nobles who continued their merriment. Such scenes were not rare, but woven into the rhythm of life, accepted as though they were natural as rain. Fines were common, stripping already poor families of grain or livestock. To lose even a small measure of wheat could mean hunger for weeks, yet overseers imposed such penalties without hesitation. The burden was not only physical, but economic, driving the poor deeper into dependence. Each punishment served as a reminder that nothing, not even survival, belonged fully to them. Some infractions led to imprisonment within the castle itself. Dungeons, dark and airless, received those accused of disobedience or theft. I remember the stench of damp stone and rusted chains, the moans of men confined for days or longer. Freedom was taken not only in life, but in body, caged like an animal until humility or despair was complete. Humiliation, too, was wielded as a weapon. Servants were sometimes forced to kneel in public, their faults proclaimed before others. Shame cut deeper than pain, leaving wounds upon the spirit that no salve could mend. The laughter of those above echoed cruelly, a reminder that dignity was reserved for the privileged alone. The severity of discipline reflected the imbalance of power. A noble might strike a servant without consequence, while a servant who dared to resist faced ruin. Law was twisted to favor the strong, and in this injustice, fear became the true guardian of order. No parchment of rights shielded the weak, only silence preserved them. I witnessed resilience, though it came in hushed ways. Servants shared comfort after punishment, whispering words of solidarity, binding themselves in quiet fellowship against the harshness of their world. Even so, the fear lingered, shaping their steps and keeping their voices low. The memory of the lash or the dungeon never strayed far. When I reflect on those days, I see discipline not as justice, but as domination. It was not the correction of fault, but the assertion of control, carved into flesh and spirit alike. Castles stood tall, not only by stone and sword, but by the fear instilled within their walls, fear that kept the weary forever obedient. In every castle, one could read a man's place, not only in his duties, but in the fabric upon his back. Nobles wrapped themselves in silks and velvets, trimmed with fur, their garments bright with costly dyes from distant lands. Servants, by contrast, wore rough wool or coarse linen, garments plain and practical, shaped less for comfort than endurance. Clothing was more than necessity. It was a language of status that spoke before any words were uttered. I recall how the sumptuary laws reinforced these divisions. Lords decreed what their servants could wear, forbidding them from fabrics deemed too fine or colours considered too bold. Even if a servant came upon wealth enough to buy better garments, custom and law denied the privilege. To dress above one's station was seen as defiance, a dangerous challenge to the order carved into society. The daily attire of servants was simple: tunics belted at the waist, hose that often bore patches, shoes of leather if fortune allowed, or else bare feet hardened by labour. Women wore long woolen dresses, aprons and head coverings to mark their modesty. Their clothing carried the marks of toil, stains from kitchens, mud from fields, or the wear of endless scrubbing. The nobility's garments, on the other hand, were woven into ceremony. At feasts, Robes gleamed with threads of gold, sleeves trailed long and flowing, and jewels adorned collars. Such splendor was meant to impress allies and intimidate rivals, but it also reminded the servants standing nearby of their distance from such finery. Each stitch was a symbol of power. Even within the servant class, clothing divided roles. A steward might wear better cloth than a scullion, his cleaner tunic marking authority. Cup-bearers or chambermaids serving closely to their lords dressed with greater care, for they reflected the household's honor. Yet none escaped the boundaries imposed upon them. They remained marked as lesser by design. The symbolism of attire extended beyond vanity. It was a visible order that ensured each person knew their place. To see coarse cloth beside velvet was to understand hierarchy without a word spoken. Clothing reinforced obedience more subtly than the whip, for it turned difference into something visible, inescapable, and constant. I once watched a festival procession, the streets lined with peasants in muted garments, while nobles passed in robes of scarlet and deep blue. The distance was not only in the horses they rode or the banners they carried, but in the cloth itself, gleaming against the drabness of those who walked. It was as though fabric itself divided humanity. Now, as I sit by this fire, I see clothing not merely as protection from the cold, but as a mirror of the world's injustices. Servants dressed in rags, while nobles shone, though both bled and toiled beneath the same sky. In wool and linen lay the quiet proof that power clothed itself while leaving the humble in bare humility. The places where servants slept and worked were often breeding grounds for illness. Cramped quarters with little light or air turned into traps where sickness spread unchecked. Straw bedding grew damp, vermin nested in corners, and smoke from nearby fires filled the lungs. While nobles retreated to warmer, cleaner chambers, those below endured conditions that wore down the body long before age could claim it. I recall how quickly fevers moved through the servant halls. A cough from one became a cough from many, until whole kitchens or stables were silenced by weakness. Dysentery, born from fouled water or poor sanitation, left men and women too weak to rise, yet still expected to labor. Illness was not cause for rest, but another burden to be carried. The Great Plagues showed this cruelty most clearly. When the Black Death swept across Europe, nobles sealed themselves in towers, while servants remained exposed. They prepared food, tended the sick, and handled corpses, their lives given to duty even as death hovered near. Few received prayers or care when they fell. Their passing was noted only in the sudden absence of their work. Lesser sicknesses were no gentler in their toll. Malnutrition left children stunted, bones fragile, teeth rotted from coarse diets heavy in bread and little else. The cold of winter crept into their bones, and without proper clothing or warmth, many perished quietly in the night. Disease did not strike swiftly alone. It wore away life slowly, relentlessly. Healers were rarely summoned for those of low rank. The herbs and remedies of apothecaries were reserved for nobles, while servants relied on old wives' knowledge of roots and poultices. At times, priests offered blessings, but words alone did little to cure fevers or mend broken bodies. For the poor, medicine was hope more than practice. I saw women carry on with work while racked by illness, their faces pale, their steps faltering. To rest meant to risk punishment, for there was little pity in the eyes of overseers. A man too weak to plough or a maid too frail to scrub was easily replaced, their value measured in labour, not in life. The stench of sickness clung to the lower halls, a reminder that health itself was a privilege. Meanwhile, nobles burned herbs to scent their chambers, hung tapestries to keep out draughts, and feasted on meats that strengthened them. The contrast between luxury and suffering was as stark as between silk and sackcloth. When I look back upon those days, I do not see only castles of grandeur, but dwellings of quiet misery. Disease crept where light could not reach, claiming those who had no shield but their endurance. The stones of the fortress protected its masters, yet they offered little to the weary souls whose lives were swallowed by labor and shortened by sickness. The castle's strength was never found solely in stone, but in the soil surrounding it. Servants spent much of their lives in fields, bending beneath the weight of ploughs, sowing seeds in orderly rows, and harvesting under the unyielding sun. Their hands shaped the land season after season, for without grain, meat, and hay, even the proudest fortress would collapse into hunger. I remember the heavy wooden ploughs dragged by oxen, their iron tips carving through stubborn earth. Men trudged behind, guiding the furrows, their boots caked in mud. Women followed with baskets of seed, scattering life into the dark soil. It was backbreaking work, the kind that bent spines and wore bodies down long before old age. The rhythm of the year was dictated by labor. Spring demanded ploughing and planting, summer the tending of fields and animals, autumn the harvest, and winter the repair of tools. There was no season of rest, only a change in the nature of toil. Even holy days brought little reprieve, for fields waited on no calendar. Tools were simple: sickles, hoes, and scythes, each requiring strength and endurance. I saw men swing scythes from dawn until dusk, their muscles trembling by day's end. The work left calluses thick as leather, hands scarred by years of unyielding strain. The simplicity of the tools only deepened the burden, for the labor demanded far more flesh than iron. The crops they raised, wheat, barley, rye, and oats, rarely filled their own bellies. Much of it flowed into the lord's granaries, leaving servants with the coarser share. Turnips, beans, and cabbage became their staples, while the nobility dined on the finer fruits of the same fields. The land provided plenty, but not for those who worked it most. Livestock too required constant care. Cattle for ploughing, sheep for wool, pigs for meat, and horses for war. All depended on the daily effort of servants. They cleaned stalls, carried feed, and kept watch during births, their labor ensuring the animals thrived. Yet ownership of these creatures never belonged to them, only the duty of tending. The weather was their fiercest master. Drought could wither crops, storms could flatten fields, and harsh winters could starve animals. When disaster struck, servants bore the worst of it, for lords demanded dues regardless of fortune. I saw families wither alongside their fields, punished not by laziness, but by nature's cruelty. Now, reflecting in the quiet of this fire, I see how the castle's power rested firmly upon those fields. Every stone in its walls, every sword in its armory, every feast in its hall was bought with the sweat of agricultural labor. The soil held them captive as surely as the law, binding them in a cycle of servitude that nourished all but themselves. When the drums of war echoed beyond the hills, it was not only knights who answered the call. Servants became the lifeblood of every campaign, their labor sustaining armies and fortresses alike. They carried provisions, mended armor, and built defenses, though few received recognition for their toil. The clash of steel drew glory to nobles, while servants bore the quiet burden of survival. I saw them march alongside soldiers, not with banners or spears, but with carts laden with food and water. Their shoulders sagged beneath loads of timber used for palisades or stones for siege engines. While knights prepared for battle, these humble figures ensured the machinery of war moved forward. Their role was unseen, yet without them, campaigns would falter. At times, servants were forced to take up arms themselves. With little training, they wielded pitchforks or crude clubs, placed on the front lines when numbers ran thin. I remember faces pale with fear, thrust into combat for which they were never prepared. Their deaths were unmarked, for they were not counted as soldiers, but as expendable lives. During sieges, the suffering was merciless. Nobles rationed food for their households and men-at-arms, while servants endured hunger until their strength gave way. They fetched water under enemy fire, patched breaches in walls, and braved arrows to carry supplies. Their courage was silent, demanded rather than praised, written only in the toll it took on their bodies. In campaigns abroad, the hardships multiplied. Servants followed their lords across seas and foreign lands, enduring disease, exhaustion, and strange climates. Crusades, in particular, swallowed countless lives of those pressed into service. Their bones were left scattered on distant soil, unmarked by memorials, their sacrifice absorbed into the shadow of noble ambitions. What struck me most was how little their suffering altered their place. A servant could give his strength, his blood, even his life, and yet his family remained bound to the same obligations. Victory brought spoils to lords, but rarely to those who had labored hardest. For the servant, war meant not honor, but deeper weariness and loss. Even in peace, the memory of war scarred them. Widows of fallen servants faced dues they could not pay. Children were pressed into labor to replace their fathers, and hunger often followed campaigns that drained the land of its strength. The cost of war fell most heavily upon those who had the least to give. As I think back, I do not see only banners fluttering or knights charging across fields. I see the bent backs of servants, trudging with supplies, patching walls, and falling nameless in battle. Their sacrifice was the unspoken foundation of every victory, their lives spent in silence so that castles and lords could endure. In the order of feudal life, nothing weighed more heavily upon servants than the endless stream of dues. Every aspect of existence carried a price: to till the soil, to marry, even to inherit a father's meager plot. These obligations bled families of what little they possessed, binding them tighter to the castle that demanded both their labor and their livelihood. Freedom was measured not by chains, but by debts that could never be escaped. I recall how grain was taken in sacks each harvest, carted into the lord's granaries while the peasants counted their shrinking share. What remained had to stretch through long winters, yet still more payments were extracted. Livestock too was demanded: chickens, pigs, or sheep surrendered as rent. The poorest felt this loss most keenly, for it left their households near starvation. Labor was itself a tax. Corvée days required servants to abandon their own plots and toil on the lord's land, repairing roads, tending fields, or building defenses. Refusal was not an option, for punishment was swift. I saw weary men stagger back to their homes after such days, too drained to tend their own needs. The land they worked was never truly theirs. Marriage carried its own toll. A servant who wished to wed had to pay a fee, seeking the lord's approval before beginning a family. Even death brought no reprieve, for heirs were often forced to pay inheritance dues, stripping households at their most vulnerable moment. Life was circled by obligations, each stage marked by payment. Tithes to the church deepened the burden further. A tenth of produce was demanded in God's name, collected even when famine stalked the land. Servants gave from their hunger, told that their sacrifice ensured salvation. Between Lord and altar, little remained to sustain them. Poverty was sanctified, as though suffering itself was part of divine order. I saw resentment smolder in tired eyes, though few dared to voice it. To resist was to risk ruin, for the castle's officials enforced every due with precision. Bailiffs tallied debts mercilessly, and those who faltered faced seizure of goods or harsher punishment. The system was designed not to lift the poor, but to press them deeper into obedience. Yet within this burden, small acts of defiance flickered. Some hid grain in secret pits, others concealed livestock in woods to avoid surrendering them. These were dangerous risks, for discovery meant harsh reprisal. Still, they revealed a quiet refusal to accept unending exploitation, a human spark beneath the weight of injustice. Looking back, I see that taxes and dues were the true chains of feudal life. Castles did not require shackles when they had debts and obligations. The wealth of lords and the splendor of courts rested upon the poverty of servants, their lives drained by payments that never ceased. Their labor filled the granaries, but their stomachs remained empty. The turning of the seasons, which to nobles meant feasts and festivals, carried harsher meanings for those who served. Each change in weather brought new trials, as servants struggled to meet the demands of labour while enduring the elements. Winters chilled the bone, summers scorched the skin, and the lean months between harvests carved hunger into every face. Life itself felt dictated by nature's cruelty, yet obligations to lords never lessened. I recall winters when servants huddled in draughty huts, smoke filling their eyes as meagre fires struggled against the cold. Bread grew hard and thin, stretched with husks or ground acorns to last the season. Frostbitten hands still carried water, and weakened bodies still bent in service. The cold did not excuse duty, it only deepened suffering. Summers brought their own torment, with blistering heat bearing down on those in fields. Sweat poured from brows as scythes swung endlessly through ripened grain. Thirst was constant, yet water was often scarce. Servants laboured beneath the sun, not for abundance, but to ensure their lord's storerooms swelled, even as their own tables remained bare. Famine was the most merciless trial of all. Poor harvests meant hunger, and hunger meant death. I remember the Great Famine of 1315, when rains ruined crops, cattle sickened, and fields lay barren. Servants boiled weeds for sustenance, while nobles rationed stores for themselves. The poor starved in silence, their lives spent as though they were expendable. Disease followed swiftly in famine's wake. Malnutrition left bodies frail, unable to resist sickness. Dysentery, fevers, and pestilence swept through villages and castles alike, claiming lives already weakened by want. The suffering was not short-lived. It lingered for years, a shadow cast over entire generations. Still, obligations to the castle remained unyielding. Even when hunger gnawed, servants delivered grain as rent, livestock as dues, labour as corvée. Lords demanded their share, indifferent to whether their people had enough to survive. Hunger thus became not only the work of nature, but of men who placed wealth above mercy. I witnessed resilience too, though it was carved from desperation. Families shared scraps, neighbours bound together to endure, and mothers went without so children might eat. Faith was often all that sustained them. Prayers whispered that better seasons might come. Yet even hope seemed fragile when bellies remained empty. As I think upon those times, I see famine not as rare catastrophe, but as a constant threat. Servants lived always at the edge of survival, one poor harvest away from ruin. Nobles dined behind stone walls, but those who served them carried the true cost, their lives withered by hunger, while their labour fed the very system that starved them. Behind the grandeur of battlements and halls lay darker truths seldom recorded in chronicles. Women in service were not only burdened with endless domestic labour, but also with vulnerability to exploitation. Their bodies, as much as their hands, were claimed by the power of lords and masters. This unspoken reality carved wounds that reached deeper than toil, stripping them of autonomy and dignity. I recall how maids bent over stone floors with buckets of water, their backs aching as they scrubbed, while fearing the gaze of those who passed. Laundry, cooking, and cleaning consumed their days. But the weight of service did not end with work. Whispers told of lords who summoned them to chambers, their silence enforced by fear of dismissal or harsher punishment. Marriage itself was not free from control. A woman in service often needed her lord's permission to wed, and even then she could be denied. Some were compelled into unions that suited the estate rather than their hearts. Their choices narrowed until little remained but obedience, their lives shaped as tools for both labour and lineage. Sexual violence was rarely acknowledged openly. Chronicles and court records hint at accusations, yet seldom was justice granted. The imbalance of power was too vast. A noble's word outweighed that of a servant. Women carried these wounds in silence, for to speak risked scorn, dismissal, or worse. Their suffering was hidden, but it shaped their every step. Even motherhood bore the mark of servitude. Some women nursed the children of their masters as wet nurses, often at the cost of their own infants' well-being. Their milk, their care, their very essence of motherhood was taken for another's heir. It was a sacrifice rarely honoured, yet essential to the continuance of noble bloodlines. Despite this oppression, women found ways to endure. In kitchens, they whispered stories and prayers, building small circles of support. They taught one another skills, passed down remedies, and shared what scraps of freedom they could carve. Though power sought to silence them, their resilience spoke quietly in their survival. The weight of gendered expectation doubled their burden. They were workers, caregivers, and often unwilling companions, their lives consumed in service from dawn until dusk. Unlike men, whose toil was marked by the field or forge, women carried both visible and hidden chains. Their servitude was not only physical, but deeply personal. When I reflect upon their lives, I see not only the labour that sustained castles, but the exploitation that shadowed them. Their struggles remain largely unrecorded, lost between the lines of history written by men of power. Yet their endurance was as vital as stone and steel, and their silent suffering stands as a testament to the hidden cost of feudal life. The splendour of courtly gatherings dazzled all who witnessed them, yet behind every shimmering tapestry and polished goblet stood the labour of countless servants. Their hands arranged feasts, their backs carried benches and tables, their eyes remained lowered in the presence of nobility. The pageantry that impressed guests and cemented alliances was possible only because of those who toiled in silence. I remember watching servants prepare armour for ceremonial display, polishing steel until it gleamed like mirrors. They stitched banners, laid rushes on the floor, and ensured every corner of the hall spoke of wealth and power. None of this grandeur bore their names, yet without them, a lord's prestige would have seemed hollow. Their efforts created the illusion of majesty. During tournaments, the demand upon servants grew even greater. Horses needed grooming, pavilions raised, and armour strapped securely onto knights. Pages ran endlessly across the lists, fetching lances and tending to equipment. Their presence was crucial, though they remained invisible to the crowds who cheered the combatants. Glory was reserved for those in armour, not for those who enabled it. Music and dance filled the air of courtly feasts, yet servants moved quietly among the revelry. They poured wine, carried platters of venison and pheasant, and removed trenchers once nobles had eaten their fill. To stumble or falter was to risk humiliation, for perfection was demanded even when fatigue consumed them. Their role was to vanish into the background, yet always be present. Even the smallest details rested upon their shoulders. Tapestries were dusted, candles lit, floors swept, and garments laid out in order. A noble's magnificence shone brightest when guests arrived, but the brilliance was built upon the invisible work of those who prepared it all. For every jeweled goblet raised, dozens of unseen tasks had been carried out in advance. Though they stood near power, servants remained excluded from it. They heard conversations of kings, queens, and knights, yet their voices held no weight. They absorbed secrets, witnessed alliances, and bore witness to rivalries, but could never act upon them. Knowledge sat heavily upon their silence, as dangerous as any weapon. The contrast between spectacle and suffering was stark. Nobles wore fine garments, feasted on delicacies, and basked in admiration, while servants sweated in kitchens, shivered in stables, or collapsed from exhaustion. Yet, the brilliance of courtly life could not exist without the labour of those denied its pleasures. Their exclusion was deliberate, a reinforcement of hierarchy. When I recall the courts, I see less of the glittering processions and more of the weary shadows behind them. Servants sustained the very image of nobility, yet their contribution was hidden, their humanity overlooked. Courtly life was a theatre of power, and servants were its unseen stagehands, holding everything together while remaining forgotten. The holy days of the calendar brought no rest to those in service, though they promised joy and respite for the nobility. When saints' days or great feasts approached, the burden upon servants only grew heavier. Preparations began days in advance, kitchens filled with smoke, and halls demanded decoration. The celebration of God became another trial for those whose labor sustained it. I remember seeing women rise long before dawn to bake bread in staggering quantities, their arms aching from kneading. Others plucked geese, gutted fish, and stirred great pots over roaring fires. The smell of roasting meat filled the air, but those who tended it rarely tasted more than scraps. The feast was for lords and clergy, never for the weary hands that prepared it. Decorations were another demand. Servants gathered branches of greenery, laid fresh rushes on floors, and hung garlands upon stone walls. Candles had to be placed carefully, tapestries dusted, and vessels polished until they shone. What appeared to guests as effortless beauty was born of endless labor carried out in silence. During processions, servants lined the paths, carrying torches or guiding crowds, their presence orchestrated yet unnoticed. Bells rang, choirs sang, and clergy blessed the gatherings, but it was the unseen coordination of labor that allowed such order. Without servants to prepare and control, the solemnity of these occasions would crumble into chaos. Even the clergy relied upon their toil. Priests needed vestments cleaned, chalices shined, and altars dressed with care. Monks and friars, though they preached humility, still leaned upon the humble for their sustenance. Servants carried water for holy rites, prepared offerings, and kept the machinery of devotion in motion. Faith demanded hands as much as hearts. The irony was sharp. While nobles and priests celebrated divine mercy, servants endured heavier loads than on ordinary days. Their feet blistered from endless movement, their backs stiff from carrying benches, barrels, and banners. Holy days that promised joy became for them long hours of exhaustion, wrapped in smoke, noise, and command. Yet I saw moments of quiet resilience, even here. In the shadows of kitchens or on the edges of crowds, servants sometimes joined in hymns, their voices blending with choirs, though no one noticed. For them, faith was not about display, but survival, a thread of hope woven through the grind of duty. As I reflect now, I see that festivals revealed the true nature of the order. The nobility praised God in splendor. The clergy claimed authority in his name, and the servants bore the cost. Their labor was sanctified but never celebrated, their suffering cloaked in ritual. Behind every hymn and prayer, their silence lingered, holding the feast together. Within the stone walls, knowledge was guarded as tightly as treasure. Books, when they appeared, were rare and precious, copied by hand in scriptoria and locked away in chests. The ability to read them was confined to lords, clergy, and a select few. Servants, whose labor sustained the castle, were deliberately kept outside the circle of learning, their ignorance reinforcing their dependence. I recall the sight of tutors guiding noble children through Latin texts, while the sons of servants carried water or swept floors nearby. One child's future opened to letters and law, while the others closed around toil. The difference was not in the soul's capacity, but in the barriers imposed by birth. Knowledge was inheritance as much as blood. The clergy often spoke of the holiness of Scripture, yet only they held the keys to its words. Sermons were delivered in Latin, a tongue the common folk could not understand. Servants bowed their heads, hearing phrases without meaning, forced to trust the interpretations of those above them. Faith itself became another form of dependence. I saw how exclusion shaped lives. A servant unable to read contracts or tallies was at the mercy of stewards who recorded dues. Numbers and words could be twisted, and there was little recourse for the illiterate. Injustice thrived where knowledge was denied, for silence and obedience were easier to command from the ignorant. Some knowledge did trickle down, passed through oral tradition. Songs carried lessons, proverbs taught wisdom, and elders shared practical remedies for illness. Yet this learning, though vital, was dismissed by the powerful as unworthy compared to the ink on parchment. The wisdom of the poor was overshadowed by the authority of books they could not touch. On rare occasions, a curious servant might be taught letters in secret by a sympathetic priest or clerk. Such cases were dangerous, for a literate servant was seen as unsettling, a disruption of order. To know more than one station aloud was to risk punishment, for knowledge carried with it the possibility of resistance. The castle itself was a symbol of this divide. In the upper chambers, noble children read romances of chivalry, while in the kitchens below, servants recited prayers by rote, unable to grasp the words fully. Stone walls separated not only class, but also access to learning, making knowledge itself another fortress to be scaled. As I sit in thought, I see literacy as both a light and a weapon. It illuminated the path of the privileged while leaving the poor in darkness, binding them to labor without the tools to question or record their own lives. Servants were thus excluded not only from wealth and freedom, but from the very words that might have preserved their memory. Though most days were marked by silence and obedience, there were moments when the weight of servitude pressed too heavily to bear. Anger smoldered quietly in the hearts of peasants and servants, and sometimes that anger flared into rebellion. These uprisings were seldom planned with grandeur, but born of hunger, taxation, and despair. Their rarity only highlighted how deep the chains of fear ran. I recall hearing of the Great Revolt in England in 1381, when peasants, driven by crushing taxes, rose against their lords and marched toward London. They demanded freedom from Jews and the right to live without endless obligations. Their banners carried the voices of countless villagers, though few of those voices had ever been heard before. It was as if centuries of silence broke at once. Within castles, resistance often took quieter forms. Servants might steal scraps of food, hide grain from officials, or feign ignorance to delay tasks. These acts were small, yet they were sparks of defiance in a world that sought to extinguish all will. Each hidden loaf or whispered insult was a reminder that even in bondage, the spirit resisted. Not all defiance was hidden. Some servants fled, abandoning the lands they were tied to. The risk was immense. Capture could bring whipping or even death, but still they ran, chasing the faint hope of freedom in distant towns or monasteries. For everyone who succeeded, many were dragged back. Their example meant to terrify others into submission. The nobility feared rebellion deeply, for their power rested on the obedience of the many. They responded with harshness, crushing uprisings with armed force, issuing decrees to tighten control and ensuring priests preached obedience from the pulpit. Fear of reprisal became as effective a chain as hunger or poverty. Yet the memory of resistance lingered. Stories of revolt passed through generations, carried by word of mouth even when crushed in life. These tales offered hope that injustice was not eternal, that power could be challenged, if only for a moment. Such memories nourish the spirit of endurance. I once met men who had spoken of joining such unrest. Their voices carried both pride and sorrow, for though they had dared to resist, the cost had been severe. Families scattered, villages burned, and leaders executed. Yet they did not regret the brief taste of defiance, for in that moment they had lived as free men. Reflecting now, I see rebellion not as failure, but as proof of humanity's refusal to be wholly subdued. Even in the darkest ages of servitude, servants found ways, great or small, to push back. Their resistance, whether in open revolt or secret acts, reminds us that dignity endures, even when the world conspires to take it away. When the plague swept through Europe in the 14th century, it carried away not only lives, but the very foundations of feudal order. Villages emptied, fields lay untended, and servants vanished as swiftly as their lords. Death struck without distinction, yet its consequences fell unevenly. For the poor, it was devastation. For the survivors, it was a turning point that reshaped their place in society. I remember the silence that followed the bells tolling for the dead. Entire households collapsed, leaving castles without hands to cook, till, or clean. The labour that had once been abundant became scarce, and lords found themselves desperate. For the first time, servants discovered a form of leverage. Their work could no longer be taken for granted. Wages, once unthinkable for bound labourers, began to appear. Some lords, faced with empty fields, offered payment to attract workers. Others attempted to cling to the old order, tightening control with harsh laws. In England, the Statute of Labourers in 1351 sought to freeze wages and bind peasants again to their lords, a desperate attempt to chain back a changing world. The scarcity of labour altered the balance between castle and servant. Families who once bent without protest began to negotiate. Some moved to towns, offering their work where it was most valued, while others demanded lighter dues. Though power remained in noble hands, the rigid lines of feudal life cracked under the weight of necessity. I saw fear in the faces of lords who once commanded with ease. Their halls stood half empty, their estates at risk of collapse. The pestilence had not only thinned their servants, but also stripped them of certainty. Authority built upon abundance faltered when the very foundation, human labour, was swept away. The church, too, felt the tremors. Priests died in droves, and faith was shaken by suffering that seemed without end. Promises of heavenly reward offered little comfort when entire villages lay silent. Servants began to question not only their place in society, but also the voices that had told them suffering was ordained by God. In the years that followed, some gained small freedoms, buying or bargaining their way out of bondage. Others remained tied to the land, but with conditions less harsh than before. The plague did not erase servitude, but it weakened its hold, creating cracks through which new possibilities emerged. As I think upon those dark years, I see both despair and transformation. The Black Death devoured countless lives, yet it also loosened the grip of feudal chains. From loss came change, and from silence rose new voices. The castle endured, but the servants within it no longer lived as voiceless as before. The tales of knights, sung by minstrels and written in romances, painted a world of honour, loyalty, and noble deeds. Yet behind every gleaming suit of armour and every mounted charge stood the labour of servants. Pages, squires, and grooms bore the weight of these ideals, their lives consumed in service that made chivalry possible, though its glory was never theirs to share. I recall boys sent into service as pages, their tasks humble, carrying messages, cleaning garments, and attending to the smallest needs of their masters. They polished boots, brushed horses, and served at table, absorbing lessons in silence. These duties were spoken of as preparation for knighthood, but for most, it was a path that ended in continued servitude rather than glory. The squires, older and stronger, bore heavier burdens. They trained beside knights, yet spent their days maintaining armour, sharpening blades, and tending to war horses. In battle, they followed closely, not for honour, but to replace lances, repair equipment, and rescue fallen masters. Their courage was expected, their loyalty assumed, but their names rarely remembered. Even the very image of knighthood, the shining armour, was the product of unseen hands. Servants spent hours polishing steel, mending chainmail, and ensuring helmets gleamed in sunlight. Without their labour, the knight would appear less than noble, his image dulled and his status diminished. Chivalry was, in truth, sustained by sweat in the shadows. In tournaments too, the contrast was sharp. Crowds roared for knights clashing with lances, while squires fetched weapons, calmed restless horses, and patched injuries afterward. The spectacle relied on invisible work, as did the victories that made lords famous. Servants felt the dust of the lists, but never the praise of triumph. Chivalric codes spoke of protecting the weak, yet those who embodied weakness, the very servants who sustained the code, rarely received such care. They endured harsh oversight, lived in poverty, and faced punishments without mercy. The lofty ideals of knighthood looked outward, rarely inward, and seldom toward those who supported it most directly. I often wondered at the irony. Knights swore oaths of loyalty while demanding it without question from those below them. The language of honor flowed freely among nobles, yet for servants, honor meant obedience alone. Their sacrifices built the stage on which knights performed, though their role was left unspoken in the chronicles. Looking back, I see the ideals of chivalry as both splendid and hollow. Splendid, for they inspired courage and devotion. Hollow, for they rested upon the unacknowledged toil of the lowly. Servants carried the weight of a dream that was never meant for them, sustaining the illusion of nobility with their silence and their labor. As towns grew around castles, the life of servants began to stretch beyond the walls. Markets, workshops, and inns clustered near the fortresses, creating a world where service extended into urban households. Men and women who once labored solely in fields or kitchens found themselves scrubbing tavern floors, carrying goods for merchants, or waiting on wealthier townsfolk. The face of servitude shifted, but its weight did not lessen. I remember seeing apprentices in narrow streets, boys barely past childhood, running errands for masters who promised training, yet offered little more than endless work. The promise of learning a craft was often a veil for exploitation, binding them as firmly as peasants tied to land. Their days were filled with toil, their nights with exhaustion, and advancement was uncertain. In wealthy urban homes, maids tended fires, washed clothing, and prepared meals with the same invisibility as their counterparts in castles. Their service blurred the line between domestic duty and near slavery, for wages, if given at all, were meagre. The wealth of towns grew quickly, yet those who sustained it remained locked in poverty. Guilds offered some protection to artisans, but servants rarely fell within their embrace. They were excluded from privileges of membership, denied the solidarity that others shared. While bakers, weavers, and smiths gathered in brotherhood, the servants who supported their households labored alone, their voices unheard in councils and disputes. The proximity to towns also meant stricter surveillance. Lords and officials feared the spread of independence, so rules bound servants tightly even outside castle gates. Many towns enforced curfews, restricted movement, and punished theft harshly, ensuring that servants could not easily slip into freedom. Urban life promised opportunity, but delivered confinement in new forms. Women in towns faced the same double burden as those within castles. Some served in brothels under compulsion, others as laundresses or wet nurses. Their work was indispensable, yet their dignity was easily ignored. The anonymity of cities made exploitation even easier, for they could vanish into the crowd without record. Still, the closeness to commerce brought faint glimmers of possibility. A servant who endured long enough might save coins, buy freedom, or marry into a craftsman's household. These cases were rare, but they revealed that towns, unlike villages, sometimes opened narrow doors that could lead beyond servitude. The majority, however, remained trapped in endless service. Reflecting now, I see castle towns as both promise and prison. They bustled with trade, colour and voices, yet beneath the noise lay the same chains that bound servants for centuries. Whether in kitchens, streets, or workshops, the lowly bore the weight of society's splendour, their lives fueling growth that seldom returned to them. Along the shores of the Mediterranean, the life within castles bore marks distinct from those of the northern lands. Here, the persistence of slavery remained more visible, woven into the daily order of households. Captives from wars, raids, and distant trade routes were brought into service, their lives claimed outright by masters. Unlike serfs tied to soil, these enslaved souls were bound directly to the will of their lords. I recall tales of raiders striking coastal villages, carrying men, women, and children across the sea to be sold in foreign markets. From Italy to Spain, such commerce thrived, with Christian and Muslim powers alike trading in human lives. The castle, with its walls and storerooms, became not only a fortress of defence, but a dwelling for those held against their will. Inside these strongholds, enslaved people laboured alongside servants. They worked in kitchens, stables, and fields, their duties indistinguishable to the eye, but harsher in bondage. A serf might at least cling to family and land, but the enslaved could be sold, traded, or discarded. Their humanity was overshadowed by their status as possessions. The blending of servitude and slavery blurred the lines of exploitation. Lords demanded from serfs endless labor, while enslaved captives endured the added cruelty of being treated as chattel. Together, they sustained the grandeur of Mediterranean courts, their voices silenced beneath the weight of commerce and conquest. Religious divides fueled this trade. Christian prisoners captured in wars with Muslim powers were sold into bondage, while Muslim captives taken by Christian raiders suffered the same fate. Faith was no shield against chains. It merely determined whose market one might enter. The cross and crescent both became banners beneath which enslavement continued. I once saw a castle where enslaved people were displayed as signs of wealth. Dark-skinned captives from Africa, fair-haired Slavs from the East, and locals taken in raids all lived under the same roof, their diversity a cruel testament to the reach of this trade. Their presence elevated the status of their masters, even as their own identities were erased. The Mediterranean world thrived on commerce, and slavery remained one of its most profitable commodities. Merchants profited, lords enriched themselves, and even monasteries at times held captives. In such a system, compassion was rare and freedom nearly impossible. For the enslaved, survival was often the only aim left. Looking back, I see that the persistence of slavery in these lands was not an aberration, but a continuation of power's oldest habit. Castles stood as monuments to authority, and within their walls, both serfdom and slavery flourished side by side. The suffering endured there was a mirror of conquest itself, endless, merciless, and written upon the bodies of the forgotten. As centuries passed, the iron grip of serfdom began to loosen, though not swiftly and never evenly. The old order, built on land and obligation, started to weaken under the weight of change. Population shifts, trade expansion, and the scars left by famine and plague all contributed to its unraveling. What had once seemed eternal began to fracture piece by piece. I remember hearing of peasants who moved to towns, escaping their lords by blending into growing urban centres. The law often declared them bound still, yet distance and anonymity gave them a taste of freedom. In markets and guilds, they found chances to work for wages rather than in bondage. It was not easy, but it was possible in a way unthinkable before. The decline was also driven by necessity. With fewer hands to work the fields after the Black Death, lords had little choice but to offer better terms. Some peasants bargained for lighter dues, others secured wages for their labour. The desperation of nobility created openings, though each concession was given grudgingly. Monarchs, too, sought to strengthen their power by curbing feudal lords. Royal courts at times supported peasants' petitions, undermining the authority of local masters. Though kings did not act out of compassion, their rivalry with nobles gave the oppressed occasional leverage. The centralization of authority slowly shifted the balance of power. I saw wealth itself change hands as trade grew. Merchants, once seen as beneath knights, amassed fortunes that rivaled old lords. Their success showed that prosperity could be built without serfdom, and their households often relied on wage labor. The rigid structure of feudalism no longer seemed the only way to sustain society. Still, the path to freedom was uneven. In some regions, peasants remained bound well into the late Middle Ages, while others found release centuries earlier. Some bought their liberty with years of saving. Others were granted manumission in recognition of loyal service. Liberation rarely came as a gift. It was fought for, earned, or seized. The memory of uprisings also haunted lords, making them wary of pressing their peasants too far. Rebellions, though often crushed, left scars that reminded rulers of the danger in unyielding oppression. Fear sometimes did what justice would not, pushing masters to ease burdens to preserve stability. Looking back, I see serfdom's decline not as a sudden liberation, but as a slow erosion. It faded like stone worn down by water, weakened by forces of plague, commerce, and human persistence. Though its end did not erase the centuries of suffering, it opened paths that would one day allow new voices to rise, carrying with them the long-denied hope of freedom. The echoes of servitude lingered long after the stones of many castles began to crumble. Though the banners faded and the lords' names grew distant, the memory of lives spent in toil remained etched into the very fabric of Europe. Generations had poured their strength into walls, fields, and halls, leaving behind a legacy that shaped the course of history, even if their names were never written in books. I think often of how their labour sustained nobility and monarchy alike. The wealth of kingdoms was not built solely on trade or conquest, but on the backs of those who cleaned, harvested, and carried. Without servants and serfs, there would have been no feasts, no armies supplied, no fortresses kept strong. Their work was invisible, but its impact resounded across centuries. The cultural memory of obedience lingered too. Even as serfdom declined, the notion that some were born to serve and others to rule endured. This belief carried forward into later systems of labour, shaping how societies viewed workers. The castle may have fallen silent, but the idea of hierarchy, cemented in its halls, survived long beyond its stones. Some found their way into freedom as towns grew and trade flourished, yet the weight of servitude cast shadows over new forms of labour. Wage work replaced bonded service, but exploitation remained, wearing new masks. The echo of the old order reminded men and women that power rarely surrendered without taking much in return. I recall hearing how debates in later centuries invoked the past of feudal life. Thinkers and reformers spoke of the oppression endured in castles as a warning and as a call to seek dignity for those who worked. The memory of bondage became a tool for challenging injustice, showing that suffering should not be accepted as the natural state of mankind. Even the architecture testified to this legacy. The grand halls were monuments to noble pride, but the dark kitchens, narrow stairwells, and cramped servant quarters told the truer story. Every stone bore witness to lives lived in silence. Every worn threshold whispered of feet that had walked uncelebrated paths. The castles preserved both glory and grief. The endurance of servants also left its mark in more subtle ways. Customs of labour, traditions of humility, and songs sung in fields or kitchens carried forward, even as their origin in servitude was forgotten. The resilience that kept them alive through centuries became part of Europe's cultural spirit, a quiet strength passed from one generation to the next. As I reflect by the fire, I see the legacy of castle servitude as twofold: suffering that built wealth for the few, and endurance that gave survival to the many. Their lives were spent in shadows, yet their labour shaped nations. To remember them is to give voice at last to those who held the weight of history without recognition. When I think of the centuries that passed beneath the towers of castles, it is not the lords or ladies I remember most, but the countless servants who lived and died unseen. They were not called slaves, yet their lives bore the same weight of bondage: endless toil, lack of freedom, and silence before authority. They built the grandeur of an age, yet their names were never inscribed on its monuments. The Chronicles of Kings spoke of victories, marriages, and treaties, but rarely of the hands that cooked their meals or tilled their fields. The history of Europe was carried on the backs of the forgotten, men and women whose worth was measured only in labour. Their legacy is not written in triumphs but in survival, their endurance a quiet defiance against erasure. Some may argue they were not slaves, for they were tied to land and not bought and sold as property. Yet in their daily reality, the distinction mattered little. They rose at dawn to serve, they bent beneath duties not their own, and they lived without the freedom to choose their path. To them, bondage was not a word, but a life. The resilience they showed humbles me even now. Through hunger, disease, and punishment, they kept moving, carried by the faint hope of rest, or by faith that heaven would reward what earth denied. Their strength did not shake kingdoms, but it sustained them. And in that endurance lies a kind of nobility history seldom acknowledges. I recall the faces of women in kitchens, men in fields, and children running through dark corridors. They did not seek glory, only survival, and yet they formed the very foundation upon which castles stood. Without their service, the walls would have crumbled, the lords would have starved, and the feudal world would not have endured. The silence of their lives was intentional, crafted by those who benefited from it. Laws, customs, and sermons all conspired to keep them bound, to make their suffering seem natural and their service divine. But silence does not erase truth. It only hides it until someone dares to remember. Now, as the fire before me burns low, I speak of them so their memory does not fade. They were the unacknowledged, the overlooked, the forgotten slaves of Europe. To recall their plight is to honor them, to give weight to their endurance, and to recognize the humanity denied them in life. Their story is not one of triumph, but of necessity. It reminds us that the foundations of power are often built upon the suffering of the voiceless. To remember them is to grant dignity where it was once withheld, and to ensure that their shadows remain part of the truth of history, no longer hidden by stone walls.